Daniel Hayes liked to think of himself as a man who had done everything right. He worked long hours at the architectural firm, took pride in every promotion, and poured his earnings into a modest but beautiful suburban home. To his neighbors, he was the portrait of stability, devoted husband, quiet provider, the man who mowed the lawn on Saturdays and held his wife's hand at church on Sundays. And then there was Emily. With her auburn hair that caught the sunlight like fire and her smile that lit up a room, she seemed the perfect complement to Daniel's steady presence. She was warm in social gatherings, gracious with friends, and quick to remind him, often with a gentle squeeze of the hand, that they were lucky to have each other. Together they looked like the couple others envied, strong, secure, and untouched by life's harsher storms. Yet behind the facade, Daniel sometimes felt an emptiness he couldn't name. Emily had grown distant, not in ways that outsiders would notice, but in the quiet cracks that only a husband could sense. She stayed late at work more often now, claiming deadlines or after-hours meetings. When she returned, her laugh carried a brittle edge, her stories vague and incomplete. There were moments when she seemed present yet unreachable, smiling across the dinner table but staring at something far away in her mind. Daniel tried not to linger on these thoughts. Marriage, he told himself, had its seasons. After 10 years together, perhaps this was just one of them. He chose hope over doubt, comfort over suspicion. Still, the unease gnawed at him in the quiet hours of the night. "Long day?" he asked one evening as Emily slipped through the front door well past dinner time. She smiled, soft but tired. "You know how it is. Clients never stop needing things." Daniel nodded, forcing a smile of his own. "Of course. Just glad you're home." The conversation ended there, though Daniel's eyes lingered on her longer than usual. Something about the way she avoided his gaze unsettled him. The house, though immaculate, began to feel heavy with silence. Daniel noticed small things. The way Emily's phone buzzed with messages she rarely explained. The distracted pauses before she answered simple questions. The absence of the easy laughter they once shared. He brushed it all aside as stress from her job, determined not to become the suspicious, overbearing husband he feared she might resent. At night, lying beside her in bed, he studied the curve of her face against the glow of the lamp. She looked peaceful, untouchable, like the woman he fell in love with years ago. He told himself he still had that woman, even if parts of her felt hidden now, and so he carried on. He poured his energy into work, into the house, into small gestures of affection. A surprise bouquet of roses, tickets to a show she had once mentioned in passing. Emily accepted each gift with gratitude, but her responses felt rehearsed, as though she were acting the role of the devoted wife rather than living it. Still, Daniel clung to hope. Theirs was a good life, and he was determined to protect it. He believed that if he gave her enough love, enough patience, enough stability, whatever shadows lingered in her eyes would eventually fade. But shadows do not fade when they are cast by secrets. For beneath the veneer of devotion, beneath Daniel's desperate faith in their marriage, something darker stirred, something he could not yet see but would soon be forced to confront. The first crack had appeared, and cracks once begun never remain small. At first, Daniel thought little of the small things. A receipt from a restaurant tucked carelessly into the laundry pile, one he didn't remember visiting with Emily. He folded it away, telling himself it was probably a lunch meeting with colleagues. But then came another, this one for a dinner 2 towns over, on a night he remembered eating leftovers alone. The explanations he built for her began to crumble. Emily had always been meticulous, careful with her belongings. Now it was as if she didn't care what he found. Or perhaps she thought he wouldn't look closely enough to notice. And perhaps she was right. For weeks, Daniel tried to ignore the evidence, shoving each uneasy thought into the back of his mind. But ignoring doubt doesn't erase it. It grows. He started noticing the late-night phone calls. Emily would step into the hallway or out onto the porch, her voice hushed but urgent. When Daniel asked who it was, she would smile with that practiced charm and say, "Just a client." Nothing important? Yet the tone in her voice told another story. Warmth where there should have been professionalism. Laughter where there should have been business. One evening at dinner, Daniel decided he couldn't keep silent. "You've been working late a lot lately," he began, carefully cutting his steak, keeping his tone casual. "Everything okay at the office?" Emily looked up from her plate, her fork pausing mid-air. Then she smiled, bright, reassuring, but somehow too polished. "You know how demanding my boss is. Always one more file, one more meeting. It's exhausting." Daniel nodded, pretending to accept the answer, though something inside him twisted. "I just worry about you," he said softly. "You don't need to," Emily replied, her eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second before softening again. "I can handle it. You've always trusted me, haven't you?" Her words were meant as reassurance, but they landed like a warning. That night, Daniel lay awake beside her, listening to her steady breathing while his own thoughts ran wild. His mind replayed the receipts, the laughter, the way her smile no longer reached her eyes. Doubt seeped into him like poison, filling every quiet moment. Narration slowed into flashes of his paranoia, visions of Emily at a candlelit table with someone else, her hand brushing against another's, her laugh ringing with intimacy. He tried to push the images away, but they came back stronger each time. He found himself checking the clock whenever she wasn't home, counting the minutes, the hours, wondering where she really was. The house itself seemed to turn against him. Every creak of the floorboards when Emily came in late felt like an accusation. Every closed door felt like a secret. The warmth of their home, the life he had worked so hard to build, was now laced with unease. He caught himself staring at her phone when it buzzed on the counter, the temptation to pick it up nearly unbearable. But he couldn't bring himself to do it, not yet. He wanted to trust her, to believe that the woman he had chosen to spend his life with hadn't betrayed him. And yet, the fear grew louder than his hope. He began losing sleep, tossing restlessly, haunted by dreams where Emily drifted further and further away from him. In one nightmare, she stood across a crowded room, smiling at someone else with the same warmth she once reserved only for him. When he reached for her, she turned her back and walked away. Daniel woke with his heart pounding, sweat dampening the sheets. He turned to look at Emily, still asleep beside him, her face peaceful in the glow of the moonlight. But even in that quiet moment, the gnawing fear whispered, "She's already gone." The cracks in their marriage had deepened, and Daniel could no longer convince himself they were harmless. Something was pulling Emily away, something she wouldn't admit, but something he could feel tightening around them both. And soon he knew he would be forced to face whatever truth lay in the shadows. Daniel first heard Richard Grant's name one casual evening, mentioned over dinner as Emily picked at her food. She spoke quickly, almost carelessly, about how her boss had praised her work on a recent project. "Richard said I saved the account," she remarked, her eyes lighting up. "He thinks I have real leadership potential." Daniel smiled, but a flicker of unease tightened his chest. He wasn't jealous, at least that's what he told himself. It was the way Emily's tone softened when she said the man's name, the way her lips lingered on it, as if savoring the taste. Over the following weeks, Richard's presence began to creep into their home in small, uninvited ways. Emily would mention him again and again, his sharp wit during meetings, the respect he commanded in the office, the way he could make everyone feel seen. Daniel tried to nod along, tried to be proud of his wife's successes. But each story carried an undercurrent he couldn't ignore. The glow in her eyes, the nervous energy in her hands when she described him. It wasn't admiration alone. One evening, as Emily scrolled through her phone, Daniel leaned across the couch. "That another late-night message from work?" he asked, careful to keep his voice even. Emily glanced at the screen, then tucked the phone away too quickly. "Just Richard updating me about tomorrow's presentation." The name hung in the air like smoke. Daniel said nothing, but his mind churned. Why did her voice dip softer when she spoke of this man? Why did her posture stiffen, her words grow clipped whenever Daniel pressed for more? The shadow was there, and it was growing. A week later, while helping Emily unload groceries, Daniel heard her phone vibrate on the counter. She rushed to check it, her face blanching as she read. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked, casually lifting a bag. Emily forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's just Richard. He's worried about tomorrow's deadline." But Daniel wasn't convinced. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down, and she avoided his gaze. That night, while Emily showered, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table, replaying every moment in his mind, the late nights, the hushed calls, the receipts. Now there was a name to pin it all on: Richard Grant. The image of the man took shape in Daniel's imagination. Confident, wealthy, the kind of leader people admired. A man who could walk into a room and draw every eye. The very opposite of Daniel, who trudged home each evening exhausted, sleeves rolled up. Proud of a modest paycheck, the dread settled heavy in his chest. Days later, Daniel found himself walking into Emily's office building. A surprise visit to take her out for lunch. The receptionist greeted him warmly, then mentioned Emily was still in a meeting with Richard. Through the glass conference wall, Daniel saw him at last. Richard Grant was tall, well-dressed, with a presence that seemed to command the entire room. He stood close to Emily, leaning in as he spoke, his hand brushing her arm in a way that felt too familiar. Emily laughed, her shoulders loosening under his gaze. As if Daniel had never existed, something twisted violently inside him. When she finally emerged and spotted Daniel, Emily's smile faltered before she masked it. "What are you doing here?" she asked lightly, though her voice betrayed tension. "Thought I'd surprise you," Daniel replied. His eyes flicked back toward the conference room. "So that's Richard?" Emily nodded quickly. "Yes, my boss. We were just finishing up." Her tone was casual, but her posture betrayed unease. She looked as though she had been caught doing something she shouldn't, even if no evidence lay in plain sight. For Daniel, the seed of suspicion had taken root. It would grow into something he could no longer contain. Daniel had promised himself he wouldn't stoop this low. Spouses trusted one another. Marriage demanded it, yet trust was a fragile thing, and his had already cracked beyond repair. The opportunity presented itself late one night. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, her phone slipping from her hand onto the cushion. Daniel sat in the dim glow of the television, the weight of his suspicions pressing like a stone on his chest. His hand hovered above the device, trembling, before he finally picked it up. Her phone was locked, but he knew her passcode, her birthday. The irony stung as the screen lit up. Notifications filled the display, work emails, group chats, and then, nestled among them, a name he could no longer escape. Richard. Daniel opened the thread, his stomach lurching. The first message was harmless enough. "You were brilliant today in the meeting. Couldn't have done it without you." Emily's reply followed quickly. "You always know how to make me feel appreciated." Daniel's eyes darted downward, each scroll cutting deeper than the last. The words grew warmer, more intimate. "Wish I could talk to you like this all the time. Dinner with you is the best part of my day. I hate leaving when I could stay wrapped up in you." His throat tightened, vision blurring. These weren't innocent exchanges between a boss and an employee. They were confessions, tiny betrayals stitched together in glowing text bubbles. He scrolled further, each line shattering the fragile illusion of the life he thought he knew. Then came the one message that made his breath catch. A dagger buried deep. "Sometimes I wonder how different my life would be if I had met you first." Emily's reply came with a flurry of heart emojis. Daniel dropped the phone as if it had burned him. His chest heaved, the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He looked at his wife, sleeping peacefully, her face serene in the glow of the TV, and felt the cruel dissonance. The woman before him was not the woman he thought he had married. The illusion was gone, shattered beyond repair. The next morning, Daniel tried to act normal. He poured Emily her coffee, kissed her cheek, and forced himself to wait. But every word she spoke carried venom now. Every smile felt rehearsed. Every glance a betrayal. Finally, that evening, he could hold back no longer. "I saw your messages," he said flatly. His voice shaking, Emily froze mid-motion, her eyes darting toward the counter where her phone rested. She opened her mouth, closed it, then forced a brittle laugh. "Messages? Daniel, what are you talking about?" His hands clenched. "Don't lie to me. I saw them." "You and Richard?" Her face shifted, the mask cracking, but she recovered quickly. She crossed her arms, tilting her head as if amused. "You went through my phone? Do you realize how insane that is? That's the real problem here. Not me, not Richard, but you snooping around like some paranoid child." The gaslight burned bright, but Daniel didn't flinch. "I read the words, Emily. I know what they mean." Her smile faltered, then hardened. Fine. Yes, Richard and we talk. But it's not what you think. It's emotional, that's all. He understands me in ways you don't anymore. I'm not having some sordid affair, Daniel. You've just twisted it in your head because you can't stand the thought of me having my own life. Daniel's chest ached, fury and grief colliding inside him. Emotional? You tell him he's the best part of your day. You talk about a life with him. How is that not betrayal? Emily's voice rose, sharp and defiant. Because it's not physical. I haven't broken any vows. You're the one making this ugly by refusing to see it for what it is. A friendship that fills the void you've left. Her words struck him harder than any slap. She stood there, turning her treachery into his failure, bending the truth until it left him doubting his own reality. For a long, suffocating silence, neither spoke. Daniel's world had been split open. Yet Emily carried herself as if she held all the power. That night, he lay awake in bed while she slept soundly beside him, the woman he no longer recognized. Every word she'd said echoed in his mind, twisting his sanity. Just emotional your fault friendship. But Daniel knew better. The betrayal was real. And no amount of gaslighting could make him unsee the truth. The morning after their confrontation hung heavy in the air. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, untouched coffee cooling beside him, while Emily moved through the kitchen with practiced grace, pouring cereal, humming softly, her composure almost theatrical. It was as if the night before had been erased, rewritten as a dream Daniel alone had suffered. Finally, she broke the silence. Do you even trust me at all anymore? Her tone wasn't wounded but accusing, a sharp edge hidden beneath her sweetness. Daniel's jaw tightened. After what I saw, how could I? She laughed, light but hollow. Because you've decided to twist a few texts into a sordid affair? Do you know how insulting that is? To me, to our marriage? She placed the bowl down with a clatter, eyes narrowing. The betrayal isn't mine, Daniel. It's yours. For assuming the worst about your own wife. The words landed like blows. He wanted to shout back, to remind her of the emojis, the confessions, the late nights. But Emily's voice was relentless, layering doubt upon doubt until he questioned himself. Was he truly overreacting? Later that day, Emily wrapped her arms around him on the couch, her head resting gently against his chest. The tenderness caught him off guard. You've been so distant, she whispered, her voice fragile. I miss us. I miss you. Please don't let suspicion ruin what we still have. For a moment, Daniel melted into her touch. His anger faltered, replaced by the aching memory of the woman he had fallen in love with. The woman who used to look at him as if he were her whole world. He wanted to believe she was still there, buried beneath the shadows of deceit. But the pendulum always swung back. That night, when he tried to press her about Richard again, her tenderness shattered into cruelty. You're pathetic, she spat, pacing the room like a caged predator. Do you hear yourself? Snooping, accusing, clinging like some insecure child. If Richard really were in love with me, do you think I'd still be here with you? The venom in her voice sliced deeper than the words themselves. Daniel recoiled, staring at her as if she were a stranger. Yet even then, guilt gnawed at him. He wondered if she was right, if his suspicion had transformed him into someone unrecognizable. Sleep became impossible. Nights stretched long, filled with fragments of arguments replaying in his mind. He would stare at the ceiling while Emily slept soundly beside him, her breathing calm, her face serene, as though she carried no guilt at all. Some nights she reached for him, soft and affectionate, pressing her lips against his shoulder. Other nights she lashed out, accusing him of destroying the marriage with his mistrust. The cycle of warmth and cruelty left him dizzy, desperate, unable to find balance. By day, he carried the mask of a functioning husband. Work, polite conversation, the occasional smile. By night, he was drowning in a storm of contradictions. He no longer trusted Emily, yet he could not let her go. One evening, as they sat across from each other at dinner, Emily leaned forward, her eyes sharp. If you keep pushing me away, Daniel, you'll only prove Richard right. That you're too weak, too insecure to hold this marriage together. The mention of Richard's name like that, in a tone both threatening and taunting, lit a fire in him. Rage rose only to collapse into despair. He clenched his fists beneath the table, forcing himself to stay silent. Emily smiled faintly, satisfied. and continued eating as though nothing had been said. Daniel realized then that he was no longer living in a marriage. He was trapped in a game he couldn't win, where every move tightened the noose around his sanity. The illusion of control had shifted entirely to Emily, and Daniel, torn between rage and guilt, was unraveling piece by piece. The night began like so many others. Emily claiming a late meeting, Daniel forcing a hollow smile as she kissed his cheek and slipped out the door. But this time he didn't stay behind. Heart pounding, he grabbed his coat and followed her into the darkness. Her car led him across town, headlights glowing faintly in the drizzle, until she pulled into the parking lot of a quiet hotel tucked behind a row of trees. Daniel sat frozen in his own car, hands trembling against the steering wheel, watching as she stepped out, her posture alive in a way he hadn't seen in years. Then Richard appeared. Charismatic, tall, his arms sliding naturally around her waist. Their laughter, muffled even through the glass of Daniel's car window, was enough. And when he saw them slip inside together, his worst fears crystallized into truth. By the time Emily returned home hours later, Daniel was waiting in the living room, the house lit only by the dim glow of a single lamp. His face was stone, but his eyes burned with wildfire. "Where were you?" His voice was low, steady, too steady. Emily blinked, her coat still damp from the rain. "Work," she said simply, forcing a smile as she hung it on the rack. "Don't lie to me," Daniel growled, rising to his feet. "I saw you at the hotel with him." Her mask faltered just for an instant before she laughed lightly. "You followed me?" "Daniel, do you hear yourself? This obsession, don't you dare twist this back on me." His fist slammed against the table, rattling the frame of their wedding photo. "I know what I saw." Silence stretched between them, thick and choking. Finally, Emily's expression hardened, her tone venomous. "Maybe he gives me what you never could." The words cut deeper than any blade. Daniel staggered back as though struck, breath leaving him in a ragged gasp. The image of Richard's arm around her collided with her taunt, burning into his mind. "You," his voice cracked, trembling between fury and heartbreak. "You threw everything away. Our life, our vows for him." Emily crossed her arms, her chin lifted in defiance. "Maybe I was tired of waiting for you to notice me. Tired of living like some prop in your perfect little picture. Richard makes me feel alive, Daniel. Something you haven't done in years." The room seemed to close in around them. The walls leaned closer, shadows stretching long and sharp. Every corner of the house vibrated with tension, as if the very structure absorbed their fury. Daniel's chest heaved. His thoughts fractured into a storm. Memories of their early love, of whispered promises, of sacrifices he had made, all unraveling against the reality of her betrayal. His hands trembled, torn between reaching for her and striking the wall in rage. "Do you even hear yourself?" he asked, his voice breaking. "You're tearing us apart and you're proud of it." Emily's eyes glinted cold. "Maybe I am. Maybe I don't regret it." That final declaration left the air heavy, unbreathable. Daniel could feel something inside him splinter, as though the foundation of his entire life had been yanked out from beneath him. He turned away, gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles blanched. His heart thundered in his ears, every beat screaming betrayal, humiliation, rage. Behind him, Emily's footsteps moved across the floor. He didn't turn to face her, but he could feel her presence, unyielding, suffocating. The house had become a prison, each wall echoing their broken vows, every shadow whispering of her lies. He no longer knew whether he was fighting for his marriage or drowning in the ruins of it. When he finally looked back at her, she was watching him with something between pity and contempt. That gaze, more than her words, shattered what little remained of his restraint. Daniel realized then that the breaking point wasn't just near, it was here, and there was no turning back. The night hung heavy, the air thick with a tension that had been building for weeks, maybe months. Emily stood in front of the mirror, slipping on her coat, her reflection pale but composed. She smoothed her hair with practiced ease, her lips pressed into a faint smile that carried no warmth. Daniel sat in the shadows of the living room, the faint glow of a lamp throwing sharp lines across his face, his hands clenched and unclenched on the armrests, his chest rising with each shallow breath. "Going out again." His voice broke the silence, rough and unsteady. Emily startled but quickly regained her composure. "It's work, Daniel. You know this?" She reached for her purse, but Daniel rose, stepping into her path. His frame blocked the door, his eyes burning with exhaustion and rage. "No more lies. No more meetings. No more, Richard." Her lips parted, a flicker of guilt flashing before she straightened. "You're imagining things again. You're obsessed, Daniel. This," she gestured between them, voice sharp, "this paranoia is destroying us, don't you dare." His voice thundered, rattling the glass of the framed photos on the wall. "I followed you. I saw you with him. Stop treating me like I'm insane." Emily's jaw tightened, her hand trembling around her purse strap. "And what if you did? What if I wanted more than this empty shell of a life you've built? He makes me feel alive. Can you even remember the last time you did that?" Her words sliced through him, cruel and deliberate. Daniel's chest tightened, his breath catching as the weight of her confession settled into him like stones sinking in water. "After everything," he whispered, voice hoarse, "after all we built, you chose him?" Emily's eyes flashed defiance. "I chose myself. And if that means being with him, so be it." The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Then, like lightning snapping through a storm, the argument erupted. Daniel lunged toward the table, sweeping his hand across it. A vase toppled, shattering against the floor. Water and glass spilling in violent harmony. Emily screamed, shoving him back, her hands clawing at his chest. "You're pathetic," she spat, her face twisted with rage. "You think you can control me, but you've already lost me." Her words, venomous and final, ignited something primal inside him. His vision blurred, ears ringing with the force of his heartbeat. He didn't see the woman he had once loved. He saw betrayal incarnate, a specter of humiliation he could no longer endure. He grabbed her wrists as she tried to push past him, their struggle sending them crashing into the dining chair, wood splintering under the weight of their fury. Emily screamed again, high and piercing, a sound that ricocheted through the house like an alarm. "Stop lying!" Daniel roared, his hands moving from her wrists to her throat. Her eyes widened, her mouth forming broken protests as she clawed at his arms. For a heartbeat, he hesitated, the image of their wedding day flashing across his mind. Her smile, her vows, the promise of forever. But it was gone in an instant, drowned beneath the tidal wave of rage and betrayal. His grip tightened. Emily thrashed, knocking over a glass that shattered against the tile, water mixing with shards of glass beneath their feet. Her gasps grew faint, her struggles weaker, until finally, she went still. The house fell into silence, heavy and absolute. Daniel staggered back, his hands trembling, his chest heaving as though he had run for miles. He looked down at her, Emily, his wife, the woman he had once adored, now lying motionless, her eyes glazed. Her lips parted in a final breath that would never return. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows pressing in around him. The smell of spilt water and sweat mingled with the metallic tang of fear. His hands shook violently as he raised them before his face, staring at the crimson marks etched across her neck. "What have I done?" he whispered, the words breaking into the silence like shards of glass. The weight of the moment crushed him, suffocating, irreversible. He sank to his knees beside her, his body shaking, his soul hollow. The life he had fought to preserve, the marriage he had clung to, ended in blood and silence. There was no turning back. This night would follow him forever, the night of no return. The silence after Emily's death stretched into hours. Daniel sat on the cold floor. The weight of her lifeless body burned into his vision. At dawn, panic replaced shock. He dragged himself up, wiped his face with trembling hands, and began fabricating a story he could barely believe himself. Emily hadn't died. She had left him. That would be the tale. People would accept it. After all, their marriage had cracks visible to anyone who looked closely enough. He stuffed clothes into one of her bags, staged the bedroom with scattered drawers, and rehearsed lines in his head. She walked out. She said she couldn't do this anymore. The lies tumbled easily at first, but they rang hollow even to him. By the time neighbors saw him later that morning, his voice was already fraying. Whispers spread quickly. Mrs. Holloway from next door had heard shouting, glass breaking, Emily's scream. Others admitted they had heard the late-night arguments for weeks. When Emily didn't show up for work, calls went unanswered. Richard Grant, her boss, the man Daniel loathed, reported her missing, insisting she would never vanish without reason. Detectives came within days. They questioned Daniel in his dim living room, where the air still smelled faintly of spilt water and broken glass. His answers were clipped, rehearsed. She left. I don't know where she went. But when they asked why his hands bore faint scratches, why neighbors remembered screams, why his timeline shifted with every retelling, Daniel faltered. The search of the house unraveled everything. Forensic experts noticed faint traces on the carpet where water had dried, unnaturally fast. Inconsistent with Daniel's story, a shard of glass bore Emily's blood. On the fabric of Daniel's shirt, hidden beneath piles of laundry, microscopic evidence of her DNA clung stubbornly. And then came Richard. Called to testify in preliminary hearings, his voice dripped with barely restrained fury. He admitted their affair, a fact that might have painted Emily in shades of betrayal, but instead it sharpened the spotlight on Daniel's motive. She wanted to leave him, Richard said, his voice steady. She told me she was afraid of what he might do if he knew. Those words echoed through the courthouse corridors like a prophecy fulfilled. The trial was swift, but devastating. Emily's family sat in the front row every day, their grief carved into their faces. Her mother clutched a photograph, refusing to look at Daniel except with eyes brimming with hate. Her father, jaw locked in silent rage, stared forward as if willing the proceedings to end. Daniel's defense crumbled against the prosecution's evidence. Every inconsistency in his story, every forensic trace, every memory the neighbors carried, it all built a portrait of a man driven by rage and humiliation. His attorney tried to argue diminished responsibility, that Daniel had snapped in a moment of passion. But the jury's eyes hardened when they heard the recordings of frantic neighbors calling police about the fight, when they saw photographs of Emily's bruised neck projected on the screen. The courtroom itself became a stage where love and betrayal played their final act. The prosecution painted Daniel not as a grieving husband, but as a man consumed by control, unable to accept rejection. The defense tried to shift blame, speaking of Emily's infidelity, her deception, but the judge's gavel struck those arguments down. Adultery was not a crime, murder was. Day after day, Daniel sat slumped at the defense table, his once proud shoulders caved in. His eyes, hollow and rimmed with shadows, stared at the wood grain as if he could disappear into it. Not once did he look at Emily's family. Not once did he meet Richard's eyes when he passed him in the hall. When the verdict day came, the tension in the room was suffocating. The jury filed in, faces unreadable, the air heavy with the weight of finality. Daniel lifted his head, his lips trembling as though he wanted to speak but found no words. Guilty, the foreman declared. The word echoed like a thunderclap. Emily's mother broke down in sobs, clutching the photograph to her chest as if it were her daughter's body returned to her. Her father wrapped an arm around her. Though his face remained stone, his pain chiseled deep. Richard sat rigid, his jaw tight, relief and sorrow battling across his features. Daniel didn't cry. He didn't shout. He only closed his eyes, a slow exhale escaping his lungs, as though part of him had been waiting for this inevitability. The gavel struck once, twice, sealing the judgment. Justice in the eyes of the court had been served. Yet it carried no triumph, no victory, only devastation. Emily was gone. Her family was broken. Richard was left with guilt and absence. And Daniel, once a husband, now a murderer, was led away in chains, his hollow stare revealing the wreckage of a love that had curdled into violence. The story of Daniel and Emily had ended not in reconciliation, nor in quiet separation, but in a courtroom, where truth had dragged itself from blood and lies to demand its price. The cost was unbearable, and it had been paid in full.